I know it's a cliche to say a speaker needs no introduction, but surely every member of the Lincoln Forum knows, has read the work of, and has come to admire Ronald C. White as much as I have. Ron is one of our most perceptive and original Lincoln scholars, and one of the most accomplished experts on Lincoln's writings, as well as a brilliant biographer not only of Lincoln, but of Ulysses S. Grant, and one of the most gifted and elegant writers in the history field. Just a few of his books: Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural; The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words; and his bicentennial biography, A Lincoln. Through his um, collections and of Lincoln's words, he has reached us and touched us and inspired us to look afresh at the great canon of writings that were created by our 16th president. You know, Lincoln once said that his education came by littles. I think Ron White's method of educating us about Lincoln has similarly been by littles, meaning he seizes on parts of the Lincoln story, sometimes small parts, from which he builds large stories laden with great meaning. And never more compellingly than in his latest, just published and rapturously reviewed book, which you see on your screen, Lincoln in Private: What His Most Personal Reflections Tell Us About Our Greatest President. In this work, Dr. White takes the notes and fragments and memoranda that Lincoln composed over the years to help him create great speeches or tackle big problems, and uses them to approach Lincoln's professional development in an entirely fresh and fully satisfying way. Thanks to Ron, it's almost as if we were inhabiting the lining inside Lincoln's stovepipe hat, that famous informal repository and filing cabinet for so many of Lincoln's notes and fragments over the decades. And through osmosis, we're following along as he nurtures ideas and arguments that we know, but he doesn't quite know yet, are destined to transform America. Ron touches our hearts and minds with this, and also keeps us on the edge of our seat, which is no small accomplishment because most of us online know how the story turned out. Ron, you've seized on some littles and made of them a very large and valuable and very welcome study. So please join me in welcoming, all the way from California, Ron White.
Thank you, Harold. Wouldn't you like to be introduced by Harold Holzer? Oh, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thank you also, John, for what you do for the Lincoln Forum and for the interview you conducted in this spring issue. Lincoln said, "I never let one of those ideas escape me." It was the spring of 1863, and Abraham Lincoln faced a chorus of critics after 2 grueling years of civil war. While Union and Confederate forces fought, the Northern public was becoming increasingly restless. If the North, with a larger army and a greater industrial might, believed in 1861 it could win the war quickly, by 1863, what was becoming known as Mr. Lincoln's War struggled on with no end in sight. Within the North, a movement arose of peace Democrats called Copperheads, who fulminated against Lincoln, charging he was a tyrannical despot and the war a means to enlarge federal power. That spring, rallies were held in various cities across the North, one in Albany, New York. And shortly after a rowdy protest meeting, the organizers of that protest sent what they called the 10 Albany Resolves to Lincoln, asking him to respond. As Lincoln sat down to write a reply to the protesters, Iowa Congressman James Wilson entered the president's office. Observing Lincoln writing at his desk, he expressed admiration that the president could write yet another of his eloquent letters from scratch. Lincoln demurred. "No, it's nearly all there." And he pointed to an open desk drawer. It was in Disconnected Thoughts, which I had jotted down from time to time on separate scraps of paper. The president explained, he said, "This is the way I keep my best thoughts on the subject." He told Wilson, "I never let one of those ideas escape me." Well, the genesis of my book, Lincoln in Private, is that his best thoughts have escaped us. Oh, we know a few of these fragments, but did you know that there's 111 that have survived through time? I'm sure Lincoln wrote hundreds more. There's only one from the 1830s, 6 from the 1840s. Let's refresh our memories. Born in Kentucky, moving with his parents to Indiana, then to New Salem, sleeping in the back room of a store in New Salem, boarding with families, not exactly conducive to keep track of all the notes you write to himself. He wrote these notes without dating them, without titling them, and without signing them. And yet we know by Lincoln's distinctive handwriting that they are his. Daniel Worthington is the director of the Lincoln Papers Project in Springfield. He and his then assistant Kelly Clausing have been wonderful cooperators in allowing this book to come forward. For we published for the first time all 111 of these fragments and notes. I say fragments because some of them are fragmentary. The first note, a wonderful lyrical description of Lincoln's visit to Niagara Falls, ends in mid-sentence with a comma. Some end in the middle of a word or start in the middle of the word. It's as if you and I were writing a note and suddenly we were called away and we never quite returned to finish it. These notes are by my choice, and the questions have already been asked, how did I make the choice out of 111? To show the different sides of Lincoln. Let's refresh our memories again. Born in Kentucky and raised in Indiana, Lincoln was part of what was then called the Second Great Awakening. His parents attended Baptist churches. This was a very emotional variety of religion. And already as a young boy, Lincoln reacted against this kind of emotionalism, this sort of feeling faith. And for the rest of his life, you and I would know this, he becomes and wants to be a very thoughtful, rational person. But in these notes, we will see and hear and some of Lincoln's feelings that he would never express in public. Just a little sketch of the 12 notes that make up 10 chapters. The one on Niagara Falls depicts a very lyrical Lincoln, a poetic Lincoln. A second one, which I find really enhancing, is the notes for a lecture to lawyers. I remember I said it was never titled. This is what was titled by Basler in the famous 1950s Collected Works of Lincoln. We think Lincoln intended to give a lecture, but there's no record that he ever did. Well, why not? Remember how Lincoln returns home in 1849 after serving a single term in Congress. He had taken a stand against President James Polk, challenging Polk with the question, where is the spot that the Mexicans supposedly invaded the United States? Lincoln declaring, no, I'm quite sure the Americans were the ones who were the invaders. He returns home, not sure if he'll ever be elected to political office again, and becomes a full-time lawyer. Basler dates this note 1850. I'm not so sure. I think that would have been rather audacious to write a lecture immediately upon his return. How were people educated in those days? Well, you were a law clerk to a professional, experienced lawyer. But again, remember how Lincoln went out on the 8th Judicial Circuit, a part of central Illinois, twice as large as the state of Connecticut. He'd be out there 175, 185, 190 days a year before the railroads allowed him to come back into Springfield. So he didn't have time to offer mentorship to young lawyers. So I think he said, instead, I'll write a lecture. Let me read the first several sentences of it. I am not an accomplished lawyer. I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those wherein I have been moderately successful. He was an accomplished lawyer. Can you imagine a modern lawyer, CEO, politician, president of a college or university saying, I am not, and I learn as much in those parts where I fail? Doesn't this say so much about the character of the Abraham Lincoln you and I have come to admire? A little bit longer later on in the notes, he says this: discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. Lincoln understood in these small towns and in rural Illinois that these people had to live together, and he was very impressed with how he could help create community or destroy community if he was going to become a prosecuting attorney, taking every case offered to him. And then I love this sentence that follows: as a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. When I wrote my biography of Lincoln in 2009, I determined that I would spend more time on his career as a lawyer. 24 years as a lawyer, only 12 years as an elected politician. Now, I have to confess that my editor, David Ebershoff, would come back again and again and again and say, Ron, this isn't very sexy. But I think that his career as a lawyer is sometimes undervalued in what he then became as a political leader and president. He was a marvelous war president. He checked books out of the Library of Congress. I think he was looking forward to being a better peace president in his second term. We know that in 1854, Lincoln re-entered the political fray. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed, led by Stephen Douglas. It allowed the possibility of slavery going forth in the territories, Kansas, Nebraska, much larger in geography than they are today. Douglas came up with his phrase, popular sovereignty, which meant that one could vote on whether slavery could go west. Lincoln was aghast at this. So we know that he prepared these speeches. He held his fire, I like to say. He didn't speak immediately, but then he prepared some remarkable speeches, one delivered in 3 different cities, 17,000 words long. But what we don't know often is what he was doing in between, what he was reading, what he was thinking. So let me read now what I think is one of the most remarkable fragments, is his fragment on slavery. This is one not at Springfield. 110 are at Springfield. They had, through the years, digitized all kinds of wonderful collections, including the Huntington Library, where I have done much of my work in San Marino, California. But I'm very much indebted to Harlan Crow, who owns this fragment in his wonderful private library in Dallas, Texas, and to his curator, Sam Four. Harlan says this is perhaps the most valuable document he has in his entire remarkable library. Let's put that up on the screen now so we can all see it. Lincoln's fragment on slavery. You will see easily that you can read the handwriting. It is so clear. We're going to have that come up momentarily on our screen, Lincoln's fragment on slavery. As we do, let me read it for us. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? Oh, you say A is white and B is black. It is color, then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. I can hear Lincoln, the lawyer, say this next comment: take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superior to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it is a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Do you see how Lincoln takes each of these arguments that he heard, that were voiced in his time, and overturns each one of them. The most remarkable fragments, probably the greatest number of fragments, are on slavery. And I think this is a real gem, a real jewel. I talked about earlier how Lincoln, growing up in the Second Great Awakening, was averse to feelings, and we don't hear his feelings in public, but we do in one of these notes. In 1855, he ran for the United States Senate. Remember that senators were elected by state legislatures in the 19th century. He led on the first 7 ballots. His campaign was really anti-Nebraska, trying to stop Stephen Douglas's ploy of moving west with slavery. But then at the end of the 7th ballot, his vote had begun to fall. There was the possibility of a candidate eclipsing him. He shifted his votes to a then Democrat, Lyman Trumbull, who would become a Republican, who was also anti-Nebraska, and Lincoln lost that vote and that office. That was the highest office he aspired to, that he could become a United States Senator. Publicly, Lincoln was very fine. He was magnanimous. This is okay. But listen to this private note. 22 years ago, now we can date this note because he uses these words, 22. Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, and you'll see in these notes, Lincoln often underlines key words as he does in his public speeches. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With him, it has been one of splendid success. There's no public place where Lincoln ever is so straightforward in talking about his feeling of failure. He never thought we would ever see these notes, and so he says to himself, with me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. Well, there's 2 notes that I include on the birth of the Republican Party. Lincoln is often aware that there are criticisms of even movements that he endorses. He's not sure that those who are advocating for the Republican Party are able to take seriously enough the whole charge that the Republican Party is a sectional party. So he takes this on. He writes notes about it to try to see if he can abrogate this particular charge, which he does very well. I want to give credit to Jonathan White, who suggested one of the notes. It's a remarkable exchange of letters with Alexander Stephens, who will become the vice president of the Confederacy. You remember that Stephens and Lincoln were colleagues in the 30th Congress. And John White suggested that this whole apples of gold fragment that Lincoln wrote would be a good part of this book. Thank you, John, because it is, and I thank you for your suggesting it. Lincoln is often viewed as reading newspapers more than he read books. That may be true, but he also did read books. And a very important book that he read, 2 books really, concerned pro-slavery. Now, when Lincoln returned from that single term in Congress, William Herndon, his law partner, suggested that they should subscribe to some anti-slavery newspapers, which they did. Lincoln then said, I want to subscribe to some key Southern newspapers, one from Richmond, one from Charleston. And Herndon said, well, why would you do that? He said, because, and I love this phrase, we need both sides at the table. I'll tell you, friends, today we don't have both sides of the table, do we? We only read the channels of which we are interested. But Lincoln did more than that. He purchased, right as he was doing his debates with Stephen Douglas, a book by Stephen Ross, who wrote Slavery Ordained of God, a Presbyterian minister from Huntsville, Alabama. He wrote this book, which became a bestseller. It was reviewed in London. And Lincoln read this book from cover to cover. He didn't agree with it at all, but he read the other side so he could understand the pro-slavery argument that he might go against it in his own speeches. Let me begin with this fragment. Suppose it is true that the Negro is inferior to the white, what Ross is arguing, in the gifts of nature. Is it not the exact reverse justice that the white should, for that reason, take from the Negro any part of the little which has been given him. Give to him that is needy is the Christian rule of charity, but take from him that is needy is the rule of slavery. And as Lincoln writes this note, I can imagine his emotions rising. We know now that often he would write by speaking the words out loud before he put them on paper. Listen to the last part of the note. But slavery is good for some people, triple exclamation point. As a good thing, slavery is strikingly peculiar in this, that it is the only good thing which no man ever seeks the good of for himself. Nonsense! Exclamation point. Wolves devouring lambs, not because it is good for their own greedy maws, but because it is good for the lambs. Well, part of the purpose of Lincoln in private is to suggest that there may be aspects in Lincoln that we only see in private, that we don't see at all, or we do not see fully in public. So let me conclude by talking about the 10th chapter, the last chapter in the book. This really gets at the riddle of what was Lincoln's religion, if anything at all. Remember, I said that he reacted against the faith of his parents, a Baptist tradition, and he did what many young adults did then and now. He rejected that faith. We have testimonies in the wonderful Herndon Informant's book of people in New Salem who said that Lincoln wrote a paper criticizing what he called revealed religion or the Bible, and someone ripped it out of his hand and tossed it into the fire. Not a very smart thing for an aspiring politician to criticize Orthodox Christianity. But then for Lincoln, as it does ultimately for all of us, life tumbled in. First, it was the death of Eddie in 1850, 3.5 years old. Lincoln went looking for the Episcopal minister who had married them. He was out of town, so he discovered that there was a new Presbyterian minister, only 11 months in town, named Smith. He asked him to do the funeral sermon. He read a book that Smith wrote. Robert says that he had this book on his bookshelf in their home in Springfield. When Lincoln comes to Washington, Willie dies in 1862, age 11. And here the missing person in the Lincoln story is Phineas Dinsmore Gurley, the minister of the New York Avenue Church, which Lincoln begins to attend more and more frequently. Gurley was number 1 in his class at Princeton Seminary, a student of the Calvinist theologian Charles Hodge. In 1862, at the end of that month, you will remember the great Second Battle of Manassas, or the Second Battle of Bull Run, a terrible defeat for the Union. Lincoln convened an emergency cabinet meeting. Fortunately for us, 3 of his secretaries kept diaries. One, the Attorney General from Missouri, talks about the fact that Lincoln said he was strung by the bitterest of anguish, said he almost was ready to hang himself. And we believe that afternoon, Douglas Wilson, great respect for him, suggests a different dating, but whatever the dating, it's before the second inaugural address. Lincoln sits down to write this fragment. This is the first one I ever examined. I was just beginning my journey with Lincoln. I traveled from Southern California to Brown University for Hay, a graduate of Brown. Now the library is named for him, the John Hay Library. This is where the fragment exists. It's titled Meditation on the Divine Will, but Lincoln didn't title it. John Hay gave it that title and held it up in several lectures that he gave after Lincoln's death. Let's put that up on the screen too. Again, you can read it. It's written on a blue lined paper, only 9 sentences, quite remarkable. Let's read it together. I'll read it. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Do you hear the logical Lincoln in that? And then this profound sentence, in the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. He knew people were coming to him to say, God is on our side, but he knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side. And yet the human instrumentalities working just as they do are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest. and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power. Fascinating choice of words. He didn't like the noisy God he encountered as a youth, though he uses the term quiet power. On the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day, yet the contest proceeds. Mr. Lincoln, Commander in Chief, what do you mean he could give the final victory to either side any day? He would never have been able to say that in public, but in private, he's writing this out for his eyes only. In my chapter 10, I compare line by line some lines from the Meditation on the Divine Will and lines from the Second Inaugural Address, where in 701 words, Lincoln will mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times. No one knew on March 4, 1865, that Lincoln had written this meditation, but it's the foundation for that address. Well, in conclusion, I've enjoyed speaking to high school students from Massachusetts to Hawaii. And often it's 11th graders who are studying United States history, and I will do this talk on Lincoln fragments, Lincoln's notes, and I'll say to these students, how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these notes? They will say with their hands raised, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And with a wry smile, I'll pause and I'll say, how about 30 minutes or an hour and a half? At one high school, when I said that, the faculty were in the back of the room and they were all applauding. You don't do this in 2 or 3 minutes. Do we take the time now to do this kind of deep thinking? Do we have the kind of intellectual curiosity that undergirds all of these notes? What I'm attempting to do here is to suggest that with all we know about Abraham Lincoln, the public Lincoln, there's still much to learn about the private Lincoln. And his notes and his fragments are revelatory in allowing to see this private Lincoln more clearly. Thank you very much.
Ron, thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I remember the first time I heard you speak was at the US Senate back around 2005 or 2006, and seeing you at the Willard later that year when I was in graduate school. You're just so wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We've got a couple questions in, and I want to remind our viewers at home who are watching on Zoom, you can post questions in the Q&A box. So please do that, and I will then relay the questions to Ron. I'm going to ask you one very quickly. This actually isn't the subject of your talk, but it'll be a good one for you to answer, and that is, when will your biography of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain be published?
Well, to refresh our memories again, most of, I'm sure in our audience today know who he is, but Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, a Bowdoin College professor who at age 32 decided he must enlist. It was his duty. He said, this war cannot be fought by the boys in my classrooms. I must also do this. And he then goes on to become governor of Maine 4 times, president of Bowdoin College, 12 years. I'm hoping it might be published a year from this fall. You and I know that's not always the timeline that we can do, but I'm going to return to Maine in July to finish the research. I've got him beyond the Civil War. He's now the governor of Maine, so hopefully we can finish the manuscript. It takes about 12 months once you turn it in to be published by Random House. Thank you for asking, John.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to that one. So we got a question from Larry Thompson, and that is, can you talk about Lincoln's faith or lack thereof?
Yes, I outlined it in a sense that he reacted as a young person to the emotionalism of the Baptist churches his parents attended. I think he rejected that. He became what was called in that day an adherent of fatalism. And almost all of the traditional biographers sort of have a straight line from fatalism, determinism, predestination. But what I find difficult is we all give quite a lot of credit to the fact that Lincoln grows, evolves, develops in lots of areas, including his attitude toward slavery. but we don't seem to give him credit for developing, evolving in terms of his religious faith. And so, as I suggested, when the tragedies strike his life, he then is open to a new understanding of faith. It can't be his parents' faith, which is often true for us. It can't be our parents' faith if we are people of faith. And so when I read the second inaugural, and I'm not a theologian, I'm an historian, but I've had some theologians help me with this. This is really a very Calvinistic document. Fatalism, I also discovered, and this was a great surprise. There was a person who wrote a book on fatalism in 1859, an Episcopal minister. He became one of the first professors of the Episcopal Seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he describes fatalism as a heresy. Why? Because the Christian faith is based on a personal God who loves human beings and who acts in history. This is not deism. So when you get to the second inaugural, you will hear a God of providence. The Almighty has his own purposes. And so Lincoln has moved a long way. Someone asked me earlier this week if I could have dinner with Abraham Lincoln, what would I ask him? I'd like to ask him, well, you've now said this in the second inaugural. Are you going to say any more in your second term? Because this is a face of Lincoln that we hadn't seen previously, his religious faith.
Can I ask a follow-up question? That
Yes.
In your book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, which I have right over my shoulder there, you talk about how, from a 21st century perspective, we might think that it was normal to have all of these biblical allusions in a political address. Can you talk about that aspect of it, that it wasn't actually typical?
Thank you. Well, I wrote that book at the beginning of my journey with Lincoln, and my academic friends said it was normal to quote the Bible. I said, well, okay, let's see. There were 18 inaugural addresses before Lincoln's second inaugural. Only one time had the Bible ever been quoted. John Quincy Adams. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Now, in the 20th and 21st century, quoting the Bible becomes almost, you have to do it. But if you think about it, not being too cynical here, it's often done at the end, and we need God's help too. For Lincoln, it's, I think, much more theological, much more sophisticated. He's using the Bible very much to make the points he wants to make, not simply to illustrate his speech.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We got a question from Stephen Gilroy, and that is, do any of these fragments that you found pertain to members of Lincoln's family?
Very good question. They do not. And here's another interesting speculation. When Abraham and Mary left Springfield, February 1861, she went out in the back alley, and in what she called her burn pile, she burned, we believe, the correspondence between she and her husband. This is what people did in the 19th century. This is very personal. You don't want people reading your love letters between two people. Did Lincoln ever burn some of these notes which he thought were no longer consequential and which he didn't want people to see? That's possible. I think it's also possible that maybe his son, Robert, who was the custodian of these papers, might have thought, well, these are my father's notes. They're talking about our family. They're talking about the children. They're talking about Mary. I don't think we want to have these. I'm not even going to give them to Hay and Nicolay. So it's possible that Robert might have culled some of these notes from the original notes that Hay and Nicolay found.
Yeah, as a historian, when you're going through an old box of papers at the archives, you always love when you find a letter that says, burn this at the top, or
Yeah,
when you read this twice, burn it. And, you love it when the correspondent chose not to do that.
Yeah, Joshua Chamberlain, he would read Fanny's letters to his parents, and she said, please don't read my letters to your mother, burn it,
Wow. There's a good teaser for the biography. That's
right.
So this question comes from Pete Rad, and he asks if there were any lessons or experiences that Lincoln had as a lawyer that he later applied to his actions or speeches as president.
Wonderful question. Yes, Stephen Logan was his second partner, very esteemed lawyer in Springfield. And from Logan, he learned he really needed to understand his opponent's point of view. He needed to understand intellectually, emotionally, and to respect that point of view. And I think this is one of the real strong attributes of Lincoln's leadership. He could respect, he could try to understand Stephen Douglas's point of view. Douglas argues that popular sovereignty is very democratic. And Lincoln says, well, at one hand, it is democratic, but it's not democratic if you don't believe that the African American is a human being, if he's only property. So I think, yes, I think his law practice, and then what I suggested in one of the notes, as a lawyer, the lawyer has an opportunity to be a peacemaker. Lincoln was very much not bringing all this litigation. The frontier state of Illinois was filled with litigation over property, over slandering each other. And he's tried to say, let's see if we can resolve this outside of court. I think Lincoln's law practice had a lot to do with his political acumen.
Yeah, that's wonderful. This question comes from Deb. What were you most surprised by in reading and studying Lincoln's private notes?
I was surprised, thank you, Deb. I was surprised by his willingness to express his feelings, his willingness to say, my life is a failure, a flat failure. Within 4 years, he would be president of the United States. His ability to read books with which he disagreed, pro-slavery books, to read pro-slavery newspapers. I think the time and the care that I think he took in writing these notes, the theological note at the last chapter where is really the foundation of the second inaugural, I knew that, but to kind of really get into it again was a very enlightening experience. And John, the note that you put in my hands that I had not really previously thought about so much, the whole apples of gold metaphor, which comes from the book of Proverbs, where Lincoln enters into a dialogue with Alexander Stephens, hoping, believing that Stephens was a moderate who initially was against secession. This was a fascinating exchange with these two people. And one more. Lincoln, we know the wonderful book written, Whitmore, Lincoln on the Verge, the trip 13 days from Springfield to Washington. Harold talks about this, but no one else does. The idea that Lincoln prepared a speech to deliver in Kentucky. We know he prepared it in Springfield because he pastes it on the back of the first draft of the first inaugural address. He really wanted to see if he could speak to the people in his home state. He never did, but one of the fragments, chapter 9, is this fragment on his speech to Kentucky. What would he say to what he called my fellow Kentuckians?
Wow. This question comes from Susan. Are there any fragments that show Lincoln's inner thoughts on why he favored colonization?
Thank you, Susan. There are not. There are no notes there are no notes on colonization. Yeah.
I was trying to think through that one as well. This one comes from Peter Carmichael. Do any of the fragments help explain Lincoln's capacity for ironic detachment, in which he was able to stand outside of himself and make himself a target of humor and criticism?
Peter, that's a great, great comment and question. I think in a certain sense, so many of the notes are testimony to this detachment, the willingness to step back, as you suggest, to stand outside of himself, to look at this with perspective, to not just plunge in. This is the danger, isn't it, of the 24/7 news cycle. We don't take time. How many of us edit our emails? How many of us edit our texts? Lincoln had this ability to step back. And sometimes even in the White House, he would say to his secretaries, I don't want to see anybody now. I need the time to think. I think that's a quality that is really important in appreciating him.
Well, that's a great segue to a question from David Holtz, and that is, in the chaos of the war, when did Lincoln find the time to be contemplative and write out these private musings and thoughts?
Well, interestingly, a fairly new book came out in the last couple of years. It was a reissue of a book published in 1947. A professor at Northwestern brought it out, and it's the story of one of Lincoln's key servants by the name of Washington, an African-American man who was an elder in the 15th Street Presbyterian Church there near the White House. And he tells the story that Lincoln would often sit by himself in the evening reading. And then he observed that Lincoln would take little slips of paper and write out thoughts to himself that he learned and gleaned from his reading and stuff them in his pocket or not. So here we have another kind of witness of how Lincoln did this. I can't say exactly what time of the day that he did this, but here's one witness saying that he would often do it in the evening. He would read. We also have testimony from a nurse that attended Mary, really, that often during lunchtime, Lincoln would sit and read. He'd sometimes read the Bible after lunch. So he also did that. And he was a reader. And I think that's what I like to say to audiences today, is that he was a lifelong learner. If he had 1 year of formal education at most, what he's an example to us is to be lifelong learners.
Yeah, there's an old issue of Lincoln Lore from, I don't know, 50 or 60 years ago that Harold gave me, actually. And it lists all of the books that he checked out of the Library of Congress and when he did it. And it's incredible to see the books he was getting and finding some time to at least peruse a bit of during the war.
Yes, yes.
David asks, what was the funniest or most humorous of Lincoln's private notes that you encountered?
Well, here the interesting thing is there isn't too much humor in them. There's no, this is not the purpose of them. I wish there were, but really he's addressing issues that he's facing. He's trying to conjure up the way he's going to prepare himself to speak to various issues of his time. So we don't really find humor in these notes.
Yeah. Another question from Stephen Gilroy. Do you know the date of Lincoln's the last fragment that he wrote? Do we know which one was the final one?
I'll look that up right now as we speak, but let me use that as an occasion to say that many of the fragments will have at the top with the date with a question mark, because both Hay and Nicolay and then Basler and now Daniel Worthington, the editor of the Lincoln Papers Project in Springfield, always trying to figure out what was the date of this. And sometimes the dates are very difficult. You try to choose the date by the context. The last note that we have is April 5, 1865. As to peace, I have said before and now repeat that 3 things are indispensable: the restoration of the national authority, no receding by the executive of the United States on the slavery question, no cessation of hostilities short of an end of the war. And it goes on, but this is the last note, April 5.
Wow, so 9 days before the assassination.
9 days, yeah.
That's incredible.
And here they are dated. I mean, the Lincoln Project in Springfield does call these notes. They're no longer fragments. Although the date again is actually, I see here, it is dated, so we know it. But Lincoln is writing these thoughts out to himself still.
Yeah. This one comes from Samuel Black, who is, I believe, one of our student members in the Lincoln Forum. He wrote, "This is wonderful. Thank you. What is your favorite note?"
Oh my goodness. Well, let me read this note. That's a tough one. I don't seem to be able to come down with one, but let me read one that we haven't talked about yet that I think is quite remarkable. This is a famous note, but if I can get to it here very quickly. Here we are. Yeah. The briefest note of all. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Now, this note is interesting because it doesn't come from Nicolay and Hay. I'm a little more sympathetic to Mary Lincoln than some are. She lost Eddie. She lost Willie, she lost her husband, and then she would lose Tad. And in 1875, she's sitting in a courtroom in Chicago that will consign her to an insane asylum for female patients. When Myra Bradwell, the first female lawyer in Illinois, works to get her out, she gives Myra Bradwell several gifts. Several are from her husband's gifts from foreign potentates and leaders. But she gives her this fragment. And just a little commentary on it. Douglas Wilson, I give large credit to this. He's the one who's taught us the use of the negative. Lincoln's powerful use of the negative. The world will little note what we say here. So I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. And the reason that I'm lifting this one up is that early on, Lincoln understood the terror and the ignominy of slavery. But it took him a while to come to the point, wait a second, this is also very bad for the master or for white people. We are both the losers in this. And we have to see what it's doing to us, what it's doing to our country. So this very, very brief, Lincoln was pretty verbose. That Young Men's Lyceum speech is long. He learns less is more, 272 words at Gettysburg, 701 words in the second inaugural, and this beautiful, brief definition of democracy.
Yeah, that is a wonderful one. Yes. This question comes from Martha. Did Lincoln deal with his feelings of depression in any of the notes?
I'm afraid he doesn't. You know, we know of Shank's book, Lincoln's Melancholy. There's no evidence in the notes of Lincoln's depression.
Yeah. This question comes from Alan Campbell. Did Lincoln learn anything from the Bible or Shakespeare that guided him as he conducted the Civil War?
Well, yes. We have the sermons of Phineas Densmore Gurley, the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. They are at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. And what was Lincoln listening to? Well, he was listening to the theology was a theology of providence. God is providential God who does act in the world. But he's also a God of reconciliation. And so when you think of Lincoln's reconciliation, his magnanimity, the magnanimity that he expresses to the South, you know, in the second inaugural, he will really come back and say, you know, be careful that we are going to take the speck out of another person's eye. So I think that Lincoln's evolving faith is a part of his evolving understanding of reconciliation.
Yeah, that is such a powerful theme in the second inaugural address.
It is, yeah. And forgiveness too. The people, I've read the letters and diaries of the people who were there that day at the second inaugural. They were all angry.
Yeah.
Understandably, they'd all lost, probably every person there had lost a father, husband, son, brother. They were angry at the South. They wanted Lincoln to say, you've criticized me. Look, I'm triumphant.
Yep.
He doesn't do either. He simply looks to the future with reconciliation.
My recollection is that you wanted to call your book Lincoln's Greatest Speech. You wanted to call it Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount. Is that right?
That was what a newspaper reporter called it the next day, but I was vetoed by Simon and Schuster.
It happens. That would have been a great title, though, because I
think it's a better title, but I lost out.
Yeah, it happens. Joe Trafton asks, do you think any additional notes will be found?
Very good question. The Lincoln Papers Project, it has been, and if you go on their website, you'll see this. Perhaps the most famous one now, gosh, it might be 12, 14 years ago, a person walked in from Ohio and said, this is a note I believe is genuine from my Lincoln to my great-grandfather, Republican congressman. Well, Dan would know the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. That's where the note came to Dan. But the Huntington Library, the Library of Congress, most of these are facsimiles. We've already seen them. They might be forgeries. It's possible. The problem with the notes is, if you found this in your attic, saved by your great-grandfather, a letter, it would have been signed by Lincoln. But remember, I said these are not signed. And so my worry is that the average person would not know that this is a Lincoln note because there's no signature on it. Yeah.
Yeah, unless you know his penmanship.
Unless you really knew his penmanship. Yeah.
Right. We have time for one or two more. This one comes from John Chamberlain, and it goes back actually to the earlier question about your next biography. And the question has to do with Chamberlain as an overrated self-promoter. Can you briefly give us your take on that interpretation of Chamberlain?
Well, that's one I've really got to deal with because that's what's come out in the last 10 or 15 years. I wouldn't go with the overrated. Even the self-promoters would say Chamberlain was deservedly a remarkable hero. But a lot of recent work has tried to show that he self-promoter, that he exaggerated. Did he actually tell some untruths? I have to deal with that. I'm not quite there yet. In what's called, I don't know how current this term is. I'm using the term the Second Civil War. It's when men came home from the Civil War exhausted. First 3-4 years, they almost did nothing. But then in the 70s and 80s, everybody started writing their memoirs, giving their speeches. Remember, Chamberlain was professor of rhetoric and oratory at Bowdoin, a remarkable public speaker, a remarkable writer. Even though he was almost mortally wounded at Petersburg in 1864, he lives all the way till 1914.
Wow.
So the controversies that he's involved in go all the way into the 20th century. So how to balance this out, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm certainly aware of the problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ron. We really appreciate you joining us. I want to remind everyone watching, you can order Ron's book, Lincoln in Private, from the Gettysburg Heritage Center. The link was in the email that went out to all Lincoln Forum members. It's also in the chat box. And so you can click there and you can get it with a signed Lincoln Forum book plate that Ron will be happy to inscribe for you. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully in California sometime
Hopefully
soon.
in California, John. We look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Excellent.